Good evening. I think we're going to go ahead and get going now. My name's Cynthia Caboon. I'll tell you a little bit more in a minute, but I think first we're going to start with a message from Dean Gerson. Unfortunately, is traveling, cannot be with us, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for attending the third installment of the Dean's Significant Conversation series. This one is really significant and about as complex as you can get. Today we will focus on the personal, politically charged, and medically centric topic of reproductive health, sometimes referred to as reproductive rights. Unfortunately, I'm traveling today and cannot attend in person, but I view this as an incredibly important dialogue. The topic asks each of us to look inward and outward from our personal and perhaps social and cultural vantage point to our professional perspective. In the now more than 6 months since the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court limiting access to abortions and limiting reproductive rights self-determination on the part of those individuals seeking to become or who are pregnant, there has been much discourse related to public policy, affirmation of standards of support for reproductive rights, requests for policy adjustments on the part of academic institutions, hospitals, and medical schools, and introspection on the part of all of us as to where we stand on this complex issue. As Dean of the School of Medicine, I tend to step back and look at the larger picture, and what I see is an issue that affects every one of the 330 million Americans inhabiting these United States. Every one of us is affected by the birth of a child, the pregnancy of an individual, and the impact that that has on our social structure. We are collectively affected by every one of these decisions that an individual makes. While to some extent we could focus on policy changes that affect all of us, as a medical school educating physicians and scientists, practicing physicians and scientists, we bring a unique perspective to this conversation. I would advocate that we start with the conversation with a simple obligation on the part of our academic medical community to do the best we can to understand and to transmit knowledge related to every aspect of fertilization, embryogenesis, fetal development, newborn development, and well-being of maternal health. We will all do our best to understand and transmit knowledge related to the complex decision-making processes of pregnancy, parenthood, decision-making around pregnancy terminations, and around birth control measures, Planned Parenthood, as well as decisions around early terminations, later medical abortions, and medical indications for abortions, of which there are many. Intertwined is the need to appreciate the significant mental health impact of reproductive right decisions have on individuals, families, extended families, and the broader community. Most importantly, I want to emphasize our obligation to train the next generation of healthcare providers in a way that does not reflect our own biases, so that when a patient needs to make a decision regarding reproduction, they will have all the information they need for that decision. Information that is not filtered by our own personal moral values or political perspectives. I also want to thank Mark and Cynthia for planning this year's series and setting the stage around expectations for that discourse. I want to also thank tonight's moderator, Paul Ford, and our panelists, all of whom represent and will speak from different perspectives on how the Dobbs decision provides us an opportunity to build on the school's mission to improve global health by linking research to populations in a superb educational environment. In this space, and to understand our community and its needs, so that we provide objective information. Thank you for participating. I look forward to our dynamic exchange of ideas.
I just want to introduce myself again. I am Dr. Cynthia Caboon and currently serve as the Vice Dean for faculty in the School of Medicine. I'm also a neuropsychologist at the Cleveland Clinic in the Department of Neurology. Dr. Mark Alicio, who's the Susan E. Watson Professor and Chair of Bioethics, and I have worked together over the past year to engage the School of Medicine community in respectful conversations about issues and challenges that face all of us in academic medicine. Tonight's topic addresses how sociopolitical and cultural factors related to reproductive health impact our work in academic medicine. We have a diverse group of panelists representing different career stages and roles within academic medicine. As Dean Gerson said, this is a complicated topic. Everyone recognizes the complexity of tonight's topic. Our goal is to create a safe space for honest, respectful dialogue as we engage in conversation on this topic so we all listen and learn from each other. It is important to remember that we are members of a community who share a commitment to excellence in academic medicine, which includes caring for patients, teaching, and furthering our research mission. What I want to do now is get off the stage and introduce Paul Ford, who's an associate professor and bioethicist at the Cleveland Clinic. Please welcome me in joining Dr. Ford. He will be our moderator for tonight.
I'm Paul Ford, and I'm a clinical ethicist. And many times, some of our toughest cases are in the acute medical setting. And sometimes some of those patients are pregnant. And so this has real-life implications, not just for our panelists, but for me in trying to guide patients and their families and the healthcare providers, including yesterday. So I'm on the clinical consult service, and this patient that was pregnant was sick. And these things are very real. So I loved Dean Gerson's talk, particularly this idea of dynamic exchange. I'll get our panelists to start heading up, but to improve global healthcare by linking research to populations in a superb educational environment. Dynamic exchange that I take, that Cindy highlighted, as a civil discourse, right? One that we can be dynamic and passionate and respectful. So I appreciate the job to have our panelists come up and do that and talk about the ways objective information and their job can influence this most. So why don't I have the panelists come up? We can come and join us. How we'll run this is we will give each panelist an opportunity to, from their perspective, to say how this the Dobbs has affected their particular role in education, research, clinical work. We'll start with Stephanie Teal, who's the Arthur H. Bill Professor and Chair of Obstetrics and Gynecology at University Hospitals and Professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. All of these panelists are very distinguished, and so what we chose to do is let them say their piece, say what their position is, and just keep the introduction brief. So I'd like you to give us a few minutes of your thoughts and what you have to say, and then I'll introduce each of you. Then we'll engage in this dynamic conversation. So thank you. Please.
Wonderful. Is this mic on? No. Let's trade, and you can turn this one on and there.
You want to stand up here so that...
No. Should I stand up?
Either is fine.
I'll stand.
Okay.
See if this works. Will the camera work there? On the Zoom? Does it go over? Okay, there we go. Wonderful. Thank you so much for introducing me, Dr. Ford. Again, I'm Dr. Stephanie Teal. I've been an obstetrician gynecologist for 29 years, and I am a subspecialist in complex family planning. So what does that mean? What does that mean for my career? What do I do? I provide comprehensive reproductive health care to women. I teach comprehensive reproductive health care for women to medical students, residents, and fellows. And I do research on pregnancy decision-making, specifically by adolescent women and women with complex chronic medical conditions. I do research in the development of novel contraceptive technologies and in the management of abnormal and unintended pregnancies. So I think I was invited because of my role as department chair, but actually I think Dean Gerson got a little 2-for-1 since I am also a specialist in complex early pregnancy. So I was at a all-day leadership training for the perioperative environment at UH on June 24th this summer when it flashed across my phone, and I immediately began to get kind of the barrage of text messages that the Dobbs decision had been released as we had expected it would be, nullifying the previously decided decision of Roe versus Wade, which determined that women who were pregnant could exercise their right to privacy in order to make their own health care decisions. And this was held to no longer be supported by the U.S. Constitution. So what does that mean? It means that the U.S. Constitution is no longer weighing in on this. What does that mean for us here in Ohio? Several states, including Ohio, had legislatures that had passed what were basically protest bills protesting the availability of abortion. The problem with protest bills when they suddenly become law is that they haven't really necessarily been considered deeply by the people who would need to enact and operationalize that law in terms of how would they be operationalized. And so that the news about Dobbs came through, I guess, about 9 or 10 in the morning, and by 6 that night, the Attorney General of the state had gone to the Ohio Supreme Court, asked for the injunction on SB 23, which was what we call the heartbeat law in Ohio, to be lifted. And by dinner time, we no longer had the availability or right or really any understanding of how we would be able to provide care for women requesting or requiring abortion in the state of Ohio. And I'd say about 4 hours later, a woman at 18 weeks gestation ruptured her membranes, came into labor and delivery with no fluid around the fetus and an open cervix, which means that she is at risk of what women traditionally, and by traditionally I mean throughout human history, have died from, which is infection in a deep tissue space, the uterus. So there we were, facing the first of what became many cases over the next 4 months that we needed to really think about. How do we ethically take these social, cultural factors that have played into SB 23 being passed in the state of Ohio and be true to what we do, which is save lives and save health and preserve patient autonomy and involve families in deciding what is the best thing for them. And so I think I'm probably close to having used up my 5 minutes with that introduction. I have 1 more minute. Okay, so I think that Dr. Kubu asked just for me to use my unique perspective as a care provider to talk a little bit about some of the cases that followed. So that patient, as an example, we discussed what would be our recommended medical course, which would be, since this pregnancy is now futile, there is no happy baby at the end of this story. There's only the risk of her death or loss of reproductive function. We would recommend termination of pregnancy. Unfortunately, it was not clear from SB 23 what we could do. That patient ended up sitting on labor and delivery for 2 or 3 days, I think, and then decided, okay, I guess I'm going to go home, went home, began hemorrhaging, came back to the hospital, and then received her abortion at that time, when we felt that we could easily say that, yes, she is in imminent threat of death. Now, we had another patient the exact same week who was 42 years old with high blood pressure. We had taken care of her through several pregnancies, diabetic and advanced body mass index, so quite obese, and works as a housekeeper here actually at across the street at University Hospitals. And she had an unexpected, unplanned, and very undesired pregnancy. She had had a very complicated course with her last baby, who she delivered just 2 years before. She'd had 4 prior C-sections. And this pregnancy is clearly a threat to her life. She perceives it as a threat to her life. She already is losing renal function because of her hypertension. She has food insecurity. She has 4 children. Is that a threat to her life enough? And is it imminent enough for us to say, wow, you have made a really rational, ethical decision based on the needs of yourself, your children, the risk of losing your kidneys, the risk of a hypertensive emergency, which is the most common cause of death during pregnancy and the immediate postpartum period for American women, hypertensive emergency. She was a Black woman, and many people, I think, know that African American women in America are vastly more likely to die during childbirth and immediately postpartum, frequently due to hypertensive crises. And so I will leave you with that and sit down as one of our ethical conundrums. Is this woman, she's only 6 weeks pregnant, I can fix this in 5 minutes. Is she, does she qualify for an abortion under risk of threat to maternal life?
Thank you. That's as powerful as we had hoped that you would provide us with the real life impact in the clinic, and so appreciate that. Next, we'll ask Sam Messiano to come forward. We're changing the pace a little bit. He's the William H. Ware Professor, Department of Reproductive Biology, Department of Physiology and Biophysics, Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. And so we move from the clinical practice to the science, to the research implications.
Indeed, the science. Thank you for that introduction. And thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. This is very interesting. So I'm a reproductive biologist. I'm a PhD. I'm a basic scientist. I don't have the conundrums and the problems associated with the ethical issues of dealing with patients. But I think a lot about reproduction and how it works. And in thinking about reproduction and how it works, and as we make progress in understanding the process of reproduction, it seems that with every advance we make, we're tickling ethical issues. We're always sort of at the boundaries of what can we do. And so, advances in reproductive medicine in the last 100 years have been remarkable. From the 1920s, when we didn't even know that steroid hormones existed that were made by the ovary and the testis, to the 1960s, when the female oral contraceptive pill was approved by the FDA, to 1978, when the first IVF baby was born, to today, where IVF is fairly common. The success rates have increased remarkably. And just to give you a sense of where we are today, with how reproductive biology touches society and ethical issues, including the issues raised by the Dobbs decision. These are the titles of some of the keynote speakers' talks that will be given at the upcoming Society for the Study of Reproduction in Ottawa in July. Ethics of Human Reproductive Techno-Fixes and Gene Editing. So there's a minefield that we are heading into. Reproductive rights and equitable access to healthcare. This is what we're talking about today. Science friction. What is slowing down biomedical research? And a lot of that is, can we move forward with embryo experimentation, stem cells, that type of work. The legacy of the egg. How maternal factors set offspring health and life course potential. So developmental origins of adult disease, the health of the egg, the health of the zygote, the health of the fetus, the health of the pregnancy will impact the health of that individual when they get to adulthood. This is a phenomenon that's well characterized now. So these issues of reproductive biology, I think, are really important to everyone. They touch everybody's life, as Dean Gerson said. And, you know, as a teacher, as a researcher, in the School of Medicine, our obligation is to develop that knowledge base in an agnostic and unbiased way, an evidence-based knowledge platform that we can impart to the students and trainees so that they can have at least a starting point to not only improve the research that I'm interested in, but the clinical practice and moving forward with maintaining health and reproductive health in particular. So that's my perspective, and hopefully I can add some PhD-ish type nerdy reproductive biology stuff to the discussion.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I appreciate you sort of highlighting some of those downstream kind of implications that for the people who put the law in place, they wouldn't have thought about the effect on research and making reproduction better. So great, lovely. Next, we'll have Julia Feinstein, medical student, third-year medical student, and also a Master's in Bioethics and Medical Humanities candidate here at CASE, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here alongside actually several of my mentors as well who are on this panel. I do research with Dr. Teal, and I worked on my bioethics capstone this summer with Dr. Mickey because, as I mentioned, I'm a third-year medical student, and I'm actually currently on my OBGYN rotation, which has been with Dr. MacArthur as well. So I know a lot of people on this panel. And I guess I wanted to start with kind of how my summer was. I was on my research block this summer because that's something for Case Western. I was on research from like June through August pretty much. And during that time, I spent a lot of it dealing with the issues of abortion, particularly from an ethics perspective, in addition to working on my capstone about abortion and surrogacy as two sorts of situations where women don't have full control over their uteruses. I also was doing an independent study with Dr. Alicio where we read the Dobbs decision, and we also read the Turnaway study, which is a book about a seminal study, a set of studies done at UCSF looking at what happens when women are turned away and get their abortions in terms of many different factors of family, socioeconomic, future health considerations, and very interesting book, and recommend to everyone who's here to read it. But at the same time as I was studying abortion ethically, I was also spending a lot of my free time at Preterm, which is the local abortion clinic where I've been a patient escort since my first year of med school. It's been one of the most meaningful activities that I participated in Cleveland, and my role as an escort is sometimes we call it a glorified parking attendant because a lot of times we're just helping direct cars on where to park, and we help walk women in for either their first visit or their procedure. But in my mind, in addition to that, we also act as an emotional support because people ask me if there are ever protesters at the clinic, and my answer is yes, every day, constantly. There are always protesters. They're always yelling things. They're praying. They're singing Ave Maria. And when patients are walking in, they're talking to the parents who might be accompanying, they're talking to the partners who might be there. They're yelling at us personally. I've been told many times that I'll go to hell probably. And so as a patient escort, I'm there as a source of support for the women in my rainbow vest, standing there saying, we support you even if not everyone around you does. And so being a patient escort when Dobbs dropped was quite a change because while I had been used to escorting on Saturdays and now I was also escorting other days of the week, I'd been used to the parking lot being full. I'd been used to there being patient after patient after patient. But when the law changed and we had the 6-week ban enacted, as Dr. Teal talked about, there were so many fewer patients just even the next day. And patients who that parking lot that was once full, now we were parking there to show the protesters that we were still there and we were still going to be there and provide care to patients. But it was a huge difference that we saw, and nothing made me more happy than when we went back and to the past the 6-week ban to see the patients being able to be there again and getting the care. And it's really interesting even to be able to talk to these patients and their families, I talked to one mother right after the Dobbs decision dropped who told me about how her daughter had always been told she couldn't get pregnant, so this pregnancy wouldn't be safe for her because she had surgery on her uterus when she was younger. Or even to just be able to observe and see all the different states that the license plates are from, showing the difference in access that exists throughout the country. But one thing I think that I kind of concluded over the summer, and this I did in my paper with Dr. Alicio, was kind of the idea that no one's ever really has a chance to consent to pregnancy. And for me, the idea of when to consent to pregnancy, because of all of the health risks and everything that it takes on, is that point at which you decide whether or not to get an abortion, whether or not to continue a pregnancy. And nothing may actually reinforce that more than being on my OBGYN rotation now. I spend my first 2 weeks of my rotation on maternal fetal medicine, so that's high risk pregnancy. So I saw a lot of cases and was able to understand just how risky it is to be pregnant, because everyone's coming into pregnancy with their own medical issues that can be exacerbated by pregnancy, or just pregnancy itself can cause issues like preeclampsia, or if you break your water early, that high risk of infection like what Dr. Teal talked about. So again, that's been reinforced. And if I didn't really understand that before, after studying my summer, studying abortion, then it's even more clear to me that people legislatively probably do not understand what they're talking about. But in terms of where this leaves me as a medical student, I am interested in going into OBGYN. And a big thing that I'm thinking about right now as I look towards applying next year is where will I do that, and where will I stay here in Ohio to be able to act as an advocate in a state that needs people to fight for them, or will I go back home? I'm from Massachusetts, to a state where there is a lot of access and I'll be able to get the full education that I need, because if abortion's not legal in a state where I'm doing my residency, I might not be able to learn everything that I want to do, especially if I potentially want to become an abortion provider myself. So thank you so much again for having me on the panel, and hope to say more later.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And you're faced with some real life choices for where you're going to be soon. And so it has an impact on your education as well as your provision. So thank you. Noria MacArthur. Noria. It's like Gloria. Sorry. It's okay. Noria MacArthur. We've already have an introduction that you're a OBGYN resident, fourth year. University Hospitals, and you're pursuing a maternal fetal fellowship starting July 1st. Is that right? Soon. August 1st. August 1st. So great. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So like Dr. Ford already said, I'm Noria MacArthur. I'm a fourth year OBGYN resident, and recently applied this last summer to maternal fetal medicine fellowship, and will be starting in July 2023. So something that Julia already brought up, which was a big sort of theme as I was going through fellowship interviews, especially after the Dobbs decision had sort of kind of marked the summer, was a lot of questions around, what are you going to do? Does this change where you're applying to fellowship? Where are you considering training? Because as someone who's going into maternal fetal medicine, one of the big sort of factors in that decision was being able to provide full scope reproductive health for my patients. And so I think that was an interesting question, because as someone who grew up in Kansas City and is now in Ohio, although, you know, Kansas recently made some great decisions, I haven't always traditionally been surrounded by states that have been open or friendly to reproductive rights for the people in their state. And so for me, I've always sort of imagined myself working with populations where advocacy was required without question. Like, I have always sort of imagined myself working with populations, particularly advocating on behalf of Black women and children in the scope of reproductive justice. And so when people were asking, well, what are you going to do? Does that change where you're going to go? Or does that change sort of your opportunities for training? Yes, and it certainly does. But I think, you know, considering the other perspective of how much work there is and how much need there is in certain communities is also an important one to consider. And I think something else that sort of came up for me over the summer was that, you know, as much as the Dobbs decision really radically changed reproductive rights for women. There are communities that have always had difficulties accessing reproductive health, and have always been sort of marginalized and persecuted in their pursuit to either have children, not have children, be treated with respect, be treated with dignity, and to raise their families and children in safe environments. Dr. Teal and I were just talking before we came up here on the panel. It's not just about the right to abortion or the right to a safe pregnancy, but being able to raise your children in a safe and healthy environment, and being able to, safely care for the family that you already have, where you're not be affected by things like systemic racism, police violence, all of those sorts of things. So when I imagine my position in maternal fetal medicine, and as a physician, that's really sort of closely tied with advocacy. So that's something that really came up for me this summer. And then when I was asked to be on this panel, I thought a lot about sort of my future career in maternal fetal medicine. I think one of the biggest sort of clinical conundrums and thing that you have to love in order to go into maternal fetal medicine is the complexity of caring for two patients at once, and really questioning sort of the medical ethics of caring for one patient while also having another patient where the autonomy and personhood isn't quite as clear. So short introduction, but I'm happy to answer questions, both as a trainee and someone who's hoping to have reproductive rights as really a large theme of their career. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, and thank you for highlighting the messiness of real life. That none of this is as simple as we want to have a slogan. As well, you opened up a wonderful conversation that we'll pursue after, as beyond abortion, right? What are the other reproductive kind of issues that this could lead to? Where is that going? Which I hope that we'll be able to open up more. So you've already started that dialogue. So we have 3 OBGYNs at different levels of their their careers, a researcher, and now we have a bioethicist that's going to weigh in. Marcia Mickey is associate professor in the Department of Bioethics. Her specialty is in ethics and prenatal genetics, among other things.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Another PhD geek, as Sam posed it. And I think that our students are so much smarter than us because they didn't need notes, and all 3 of us did. So I'm not sure what that's about. But yes, I'm a social scientist who became an empirical bioethicist. So I'm an anthropologist. And in other words, what I do is I use the tools and the lenses of social science to shed light on ethical issues in biomedicine. And my work does mostly focus on reproductive ethics, especially related to genetics. So tonight's topic really pretty much describes everything that I do. And my work really doesn't focus so much on abortion, even though, of course, the culture wars surrounding abortion color every conversation in this space. And in the last year, of course, I've had no choice but to spend a lot of time talking about abortion. But what I generally do is actually, as you were prefacing, talk not about abortion politics and rights generally, but how it impacts the people in the situations that I know best, which is when pregnancies are impacted by genetic tests and diagnoses. So it turns out that it impacts those people in those situations quite a lot. I want to pause here and say that even though the ethical framing we usually hear around abortion politics in the U.S. is reproductive rights, and you've heard that term tonight, pro-life, pro-choice, that's not really the framing that I usually rely on. I find it a little bit too narrow and binary for what I want to do. Are you for or against abortion? From a social cultural perspective, that's really too simplistic. And we know, of course, that the vast majority, really, of Americans do think that abortion should be legal in some circumstances, but which circumstances, how many, that varies a lot. And most Americans, I think, also would put some limits on abortion, maybe big ones, maybe only tiny ones. But most importantly, abortion is only one small part of reproductive health and reproductive health care. I think that Noria really, it was like a great segue to some of the stuff that I wanted to also talk about. Access to good prenatal care and good pre-pregnancy reproductive health care is a real challenge for many Americans. As Dr. Teal mentioned, there are huge disparities in infant and maternal morbidity and mortality by race especially. Infertility disproportionately affects Black women as compared to white women in the U.S. And infertility services themselves are statistically less successful and also less accessible for Black patients than for white patients. So what we know is that women of color, although they've always been part of the reproductive rights movement, found that their community's much broader concerns about reproductive health weren't being well represented by the laser focus that we've sometimes had on access to abortion and contraception. And they articulated, actually, Noria articulated very well, although she didn't name it, a framework called reproductive justice from the late 80s and 90s, bringing reproductive rights and social justice together, right? And just as Noria said, it includes the right to have children, the right not to have children, the right to parent the children that we do have in safe and healthy environments, and it also includes the right to sexual expression for all people. So this framework of reproductive justice I find to be really, really helpful when we think about the impact of abortion law on everyone's reproductive rights and lives, I should say, not just people who find that, oops, I'm pregnant and I don't want to be pregnant. That is an important population. But in my research, I mostly talk to people who are finding out that their much wanted, much desired future child may have a genetic condition. And those people, even when they opt to continue a pregnancy, get very much impacted by abortion laws and abortion politics. They are painted as irresponsible if they end the pregnancy. They're painted as irresponsible if they don't end the pregnancy by different people. They sometimes find out that the fetus is likely going to die in utero or be stillborn, or maybe their child will make it to birth, but could suffer and die early. And so they may very much want this child, and at the same time, they want to balance that desire to keep their child from suffering, to protect mom's health, to protect the health of the family and keep the family intact. And that's really, really important to them. And then for those folks that are working for the health of these families, like many of the folks here, abortion politics are also a huge concern, as you've heard. Researchers, doctors are working to develop these cutting-edge parental fetal surgeries or treatments, and they may not be legally safe in some states. They could be censured or even jailed if there's a fetal death, especially for these really new, exciting interventions that haven't yet become standard of care. And this likely is going to mean, by the way, that those innovative research programs are going to move to friendlier jurisdictions, which is going to further limit the reproductive healthcare options for people in those states. So there's that. Parents and doctors alike could be subject to investigation of an unexpected fetal demise, especially states like this one that have so-called reason-based bans on abortion for genetic conditions. Even if the demise is entirely natural and unavoidable, and that does happen, of course, with genetic conditions and other reasons, parents may have to deal with extra state surveillance, unkind media coverage, we know that happens, even maybe having to mount a legal defense while at the same time mourning a wanted pregnancy. So in conclusion, I focus on these families and these situations because they're so familiar to me in my own research, and because they're not what we usually hear about in these binary pro-life, pro-choice debates, but they are families who deserve reproductive justice. Again, the right to have, not have a child according to their own values, to parent their children in safe and healthy environments. And so those are the voices that I try to amplify when I'm asked, as often I am now, about abortion politics. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you. That's a great way to move the conversation to the questions that part of what I hear in a number of these is there are real people that are impacted by this sort of law that can be easily seen as, binary but there are real people who suffer and real people's stories, providers, patients, families that we need to consider. So, yeah, please. So I know there's Zoom people that have an opportunity to ask some questions. Coming out of this, out of a set of conversations like this, I always have half a dozen questions in my own head. But as the facilitator, I know I need to keep those and give people in the audience a chance to start asking questions unless I need to prime the pump. So do you have some questions or observations for the panel to start off with, or do you need us to get it started?
And I guess just that for those of you who are participating via Zoom, I'm here, I'm monitoring the chat. Please type your questions into the chat. I'll read them and identify you as well. And if you don't want if you want to keep it confidential, that's fine as well. Okay.
So I think that while you can continue to think, I'd like to turn a question of my own to the panel. So the dean talked about understand our community and its needs, and community came up in a number of these, and provide the objective information to the community and communities, I would say, that we end up dealing with serving. So in each of your positions, what do you think is the most singular, important kind of objective knowledge to pass on to people that you are teaching and training and interacting with? Right? Because you teach and train your students, your patients, their families, your PhD colleagues. Each one of you has a role. So if part of our thing is to say we need to create and promulgate objective knowledge, what's the kind of thing that for the people that you interact with to better understanding and to serve the community?
Since I'm holding the mic, I guess I'll start and then pass it down. And I would say that the most important message that I want to convey when I speak on this topic, whether it's one-on-one with a medical student or a resident or in a forum, is pregnancy is much more complicated than you might think if you weren't an obstetrician gynecologist. I'll just put a period at the end of it and pass the mic.
Someone else had something to say. I can just quickly say I think that the ethics of pregnancy are also much more complicated than most people think. I think that when people hear about late-term abortions or other things that they think, well, that doesn't seem right, and then you tell the whole story about these folks that are dealing with very complicated issues, and they go, oh, that's a little more complicated than I thought it was. And I think things get boiled down to very simplistic things in the press and the way that dialogue gets framed in these binary ways, and that's really problematic for understanding.
Yeah, I agree. The two individuals maintaining homeostasis in the one body. The fetus has to develop, and it's trying to extract resources from the mom. The mom has to continue to live in the world. This is a very, very complex physiology that has lots of places where it can go wrong. And so, the maternal fetal medicine specialists, as Noria mentioned, are constantly dealing with this balance between these two physiologies in order to get the optimum outcome. And one of the things we try to emphasize to the medical students is to understand that complexity and to understand the key signals that are coming back and forth from the placenta to the mother, from the mother to the placenta, and our basic understanding of that, which is nowhere near complete. And so as a teacher in the medical school and teaching to the medical students, I like to emphasize that what we understand is nowhere near what we need to understand, and that we need to understand more to understand the problems that the clinicians see. And as clinicians, they need to be aware that they need to be clinician scientists in many ways, because in a lot of situations they're going to be going in blind. And so to have that level of curiosity and tenacity to know more, I think it will only do good for us in the future in terms of understanding these issues.
Just want to interject one thing. We started this significant conversation series with understanding from different lenses and perspectives, which requires humility, and all three of you have mentioned that. So I just want to point out that observation.
So we have
We've got
We'll let Julie speak for a second.
yeah, and
I was just going to add that I think one of the things that I notice most and that I try to talk to others about is just kind of like the irony surrounding the laws and just the way that some laws, for instance, like in Ohio, they have like abstinence only education. So just how that factors into banning abortion, but then also not teaching teenagers what they need to know to be able to prevent pregnancy in the first place. And there's like a whole series of that. I have a whole list of things I want to write in my future of just why these laws just don't make sense and they aren't really compatible with other laws. Another thing that comes to mind is the issue of brain death patients who are pregnant. And I forget what state it is, but one of the ones that has really harsh abortion laws is one of the only states where pregnant patients who are brain dead are allowed to then not have the abortion as a result. So there's a lot of irony in the laws that exist. And I think that's another thing that I think about and tell others about a lot.
I would just add, I know you mentioned humility already, and I think that, is something important that I, think to pass on to learners, but also one of the biggest growth points for me throughout residency. I think when I first started residency, I thought I had to have clear answers for all of my patients. And then I thought that it would show a point of weakness if I told a patient, I don't know, or I'm not sure, I have to kind of figure it out with you. And one of the concepts that comes from community health work is sort of the idea of like, hold my hand and I will walk with you. And so it's this idea that what's so much more important to the physician-patient relationship is not necessarily that you're sort of this all-knowing, omnipotent, I'm going to have all the answers and I'll fix it for you, but really sitting with your patient and understanding their values and knowing that it's not all clear, but knowing that they have a support and guide in you to just put one foot in front of the other.
Thank you all for those responses. I think we have a question at the back.
Thank you. My name is David Preston. I'm a professor of neurology here at Case. My question is for the panel, what's the best way forward? And should medical professionals get more politically active? Because traditionally, doctors are not politically active. They're too busy taking care of patients, and they let other people kind of make decisions for the medical profession. So in my humble opinion, which probably not everyone will agree with, I think that we need a middle-of-the-road type of solution here. I think it's got to be a political solution, and I think that we'll never get a situation that everyone is happy. So in my opinion, I think we need a referendum in the state of Ohio that makes abortion legal up to some number, maybe 15 weeks, and above that, it remains legal to save the life of the mother. And that would solve the problem in 90% of the cases. And then we can argue ad nauseum about the last 10% about how to fix that and make it better going forward. But I think we need a way going forward, and I'd be curious to know what you think the best way going forward is.
So I would like to respectfully push back on the idea that somehow all of us putting our heads together and saying, yeah, 15 weeks, that makes sense, is the way that we deliver rational medical care to patients. It may come as a surprise to people that 90% of abortions in America occur before 12 weeks. 80% of abortions occur before 9 weeks. 80% of abortions occur before 9 weeks of pregnancy. So when I see things like a 15-week ban, I'm like, based on what? Based on what evidence? What's the rationale, the rational evidence? Is it to make people feel better? Or is it actually to take better care of us, our family members, our community members, any of us who are patients, can be patients, could be patients, our children, our parents? Is that why we're having a 15-week ban? Or is it to somehow try to come to some middle ground? So again, just in the spirit of the academic discussion, that's why I'm pushing back to you. But again, that's your, it's not quite viability. But then what is the viability for an anencephalic? 0. What is the viability for the patient I left you with, who's 42 years old with hypertension, already having reduction in her renal function, already potentially not able to provide enough food for her children? What's her viability? So 90% of abortions occur before 12 weeks. The patients actually who get caught in a 15-week ban are the patients who receive these types of diagnoses that cannot be detected prior to sonography that occurs at 18 weeks. So again, the kind of, from the obstetrician standpoint, the 15-week ban doesn't have a medical rationale.
So I think I'm going to step in just for a moment, because This could go in a variety of ways, and while activism or other things might take place, we still have the real world problem that we have to. This is going to impact each of your daily practices, and we have to find part of that the way forward, even if we find the right line. One thing that I think is of importance that came up in some dialogue, language. So I'd like it twofold. First, I'd like to come back to what you just told us, and so that I can get clarity of language. And then I want you to reflect on how language in this sphere either helps or hinders your conversations in research, teaching, and care, and with those who you care for who might have been on the demonstration lines, right? So you said 90% of abortions, so a large portion happen before 15 weeks. Now, 12 weeks. Does that count spontaneous abortions? And this is where the language gets odd. When I think of abortion, I think of a induced state. But when I hear some of my OB colleagues say abortion, what they mean is the pregnancy sometimes aborts spontaneous. Can you help me with that language, and then we'll bigger question?
And anybody else could have answered that as well there. But so abortion means the separation of the pregnancy from the mother. So that would be a spontaneous abortion and induced abortion. So miscarriages are abortion. Sometimes we run into trouble with billing because we put abortion because that's what it was. But, so when I was talking about when abortions occur, in fact, I was talking about induced abortion. So 90% of induced abortions occur before 12 weeks gestation. And that is a number that has been rising. The gestational age at which people have abortions has been going down as pregnancy detection methods have become better and better.
Thank you. I appreciate that you answered his question with that kind of precision, because I see some families devastated when they're told that a spontaneous abortion happened, thinking that now they aborted and it was against their.
There's a question from the Zoom audience that maybe kind of, I think, relates to this. So I'm going to read it out. It's very thoughtfully written. Thank you all for your insightful comments. How do you think we should approach teaching medical students, residents, and fellows about abortion, miscarriage, and early pregnancy management? Part of this is procedural, which is challenged by Dobbs, but there's also learning how to discuss abortion, exactly the language that we use, in an accurate, sensitive, and patient-centered way that enables patients to make an informed decision. How can we ensure our trainees have these procedural and healthcare communication skills that are so important to the practice of reproductive medicine? And that may get at another kind of question that came up is, given there's going to be a variety of different perspectives regarding this very complex topic, for some individuals that fetus is a human, for some it's not, and how do we have that kind of respectful dialogue with our patients to meet them where they are? And I think that that's where it gets tricky, right? Because it means really being open and humble in a way to communicate.
Well, let me just say, and I think I want to defer to my OBGYN colleagues about the latter part of it, but I think it gets to your point about language, which is to recognize that people who are engaging in this discussion, who don't come from a medical background, are using a terminology from the press, from popular media, that often is manipulated, honestly, in very, very particular ways for particular political ends from various perspectives, and they don't actually match with the legitimate medical terminology. And I think that one of the things that we are going to have to teach everyone who interacts with patients, and in fact, even people like me who interact with other people around these issues, is how to recognize that those terms and sort of proactively counter with I understand that you understand this term this way. In fact, this other term is the term we use in medicine, and here's how it differs from your term. And knowing that you're going to have to do that from the outset, I think is going to be really important. I think that's already part, in some ways, of your teaching, but it's something that we're going to have to continue to do.
I just wanted to hear from our trainees about how we teach, how we should be teaching medical students and residents.
I think one opportunity I actually got to have this past weekend is I got to go to the Northeast Ohio Women's Center as part of my OBGYN rotation. So I thought that was a really incredible experience. It was an opt-in thing of who was on my rotation. So it's mainly just the people who are actually interested in OBGYN who decide to go. But I was able to go and watch abortion procedures happen, and I thought that was really valuable to my experience to be able to see. And what the doctor who does it, who owns a lot of the abortion clinics in Ohio, was emphasizing to us was, see, it's a quick procedure. It's very, much less risky than a lot of other things we would do, and just to be able to get that sense. And I think that and I think one of the things he said to me on our way out is, when I'm considering residency programs, look for one where it's opt out of the abortion training versus opt in for OBGYN residencies. So in terms of the abortion training. So I think that the way that he put it is something that I think could also apply in the earlier medical education, that it could be useful for everyone, not just those who express a particular interest in being able to see and get exposure to this experience, to actually be in an abortion clinic, to be holding the hand of a woman who's getting an abortion, who it might be an easy decision for her, but also it's still very sad and an emotional experience to be able to watch. So I really valued that, and I think that that's something that can definitely be talked about. I think also just talking more about it generally, and opening that dialogue. There's a lot of med student groups, like Med Students for Choice, and the OBGYN interest groups that will hold events that talk about it. But a lot of this stuff ends up being self-selecting, and I do notice that sometimes, especially when the Ohio laws keep on changing, it is hard to keep track of what's even going on. So I think just it could have a lot of potential for a broader education on what's going on in the day-to-day. I think a lot of my classmates might not know even that abortion is legal right now in Ohio, just because it changes every day. And I think that's something that we can put a lot more emphasis on, is not just knowing and learning, but being aware of our surroundings, especially being here in Ohio where things change so much.
So, Nora, do you have some thoughts? Particularly, are there some landmines with language? You said you are interested in those populations that might have felt underrepresented, minoritized. Anything globally that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think kind of just going back to what certainly language matters, and I think the way in which we engage with patients and the language we choose to use can immediately either shut down or open up a patient conversation and their trust in you as their physician. What Julia brought up is, I think, really important, is sort of the demystification of the whole process, because I think there's a lot of, as we mentioned, media hype surrounding what abortion is, what it isn't, what do those procedures look like? And, certainly the same medical procedures that we perform for a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage is the same exact procedure that you would perform for an induced abortion. So the practicality of it is exactly the same. And I think sort of seeing what that procedure looks like sort of takes all the clouds and sort of hype around it, and you're oh, I guess this is what it is. I will say my own experience in residency training and being trained in how to do certain procedures and being exposed to certain procedures, I think holding space for everyone will have different and valid emotions surrounding performing certain procedures. And when I was at preterm, I provided a later gestation abortion, and I think I was surprised with what emotions came up for me. And I thought kind of oh, well, what does that mean? Am I on the wrong side? Am I a bad obstetrician because I felt something, or because I felt why was this person coming at, this gestational age instead of an early gestational age? And then I sort of had to question my own understanding of where this person was coming from and why I thought maybe this abortion was less valid than someone else's reason or something like that. So I think holding space that it is more complicated and there are emotions that may come up that you weren't expecting for yourself has been important for me in residency. So
Great. Thank you. I think we have another question from the audience.
Okay. Hi, I'm Ellen Gellis. I am an internist at Metro, and I am the Health and Public Policy Chair for the Ohio chapter of the American College of Physicians, which represents about 6,000 internists in Ohio. I am very concerned about workforce. It's physician workforce in Ohio. We have a primary care crisis in Ohio. We do not have enough primary care physicians, and at least today, I'm including you all you provide a lot of primary care. Obstetrician gynecologists provide a lot of primary care to women or other individuals in Ohio. And I want to know what you are seeing. I am interested in Dr. Teal and Dr. Noria. Sorry, I didn't catch your last name.
MacArthur.
And Julia, are you seeing, Dr. Teal, like less applicants to your residency programs? Are you seeing your faculty leaving Ohio? Julia and Noria, are you seeing people choose not to either train or practice in Ohio? It's sort of anecdotally, we make that argument to legislators, but I don't know if it's in fact true and what we're seeing.
2 weeks after the Dobbs decision, a reproductive endocrinologist and infertility specialist who I had been recruiting, who had signed a letter of intent with us at UH, called me and said she was taking the job in Seattle. She and her husband, who's also a physician at UH, already decided that they couldn't stay here. Fantastic physician, young, dynamic, really a triple threat kind of person. And yeah, we lost her over it. And it absolutely has come up. It has come up not just with the physician workforce. So that's just like kind of the recruiting physicians. Then I also have a colleague who was a physician at Ohio State who left and took an opening at Chicago because she was already employed, as an OBGYN, and she's like, I can't provide the kind of care I want to provide. So yeah, even just in those couple of months, several kind of anecdotal N of one, not staying. But the real concern, as you pointed out, is will we get our best candidates to stay? Because here's how it goes, as you well know, is that where people train to a large extent, because you train kind of between the ages of 25 and 30, which is also the time where you're in a certain period of family formation. A lot of times where people train is where they stay, and that's where we get doctors who provide care to the people of Ohio. And if people say, I don't really want to train there, but maybe I'll come back later. It's like, and now you met somebody, and now blah, 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 and then you've got this research project. It's very hard to get people back if they go. So it's a big concern. It's a big concern. In OBGYN, I'm going to just say it, that we have fantastic candidates who do not provide abortion. I would say, though, they are more the minority. That really our best candidates in OBGYN are the ones who are most thoughtful about providing comprehensive care to the whole person. And usually those people also want to learn, as Julia was saying and as Noria was saying, how to provide abortion care. And so we are going to have, I strongly perceive that we are going to have not the people who we would most prefer to keep here or to have here in Ohio to train. We are not going to be able to bring the physicians. And then there's the entire workforce issue of, if I work for Intel or Google or whatever, that we're trying to bring to whatever industry we're trying to bring to Ohio, do I, as an engineer for Intel, want to come to a state where I might not be able to have my reproductive needs met?
Yeah.
So, do you want to comment on that?
I mean, I can go back and answer the question. I don't think my parents will be happy if I stay here anyways, and they're on this call. They really want me home, but so that was a consideration coming into med school in the first place. But I think that for me, it is a factor in whether or not I stay. I do want the full spectrum of my training, but as I mentioned, I've also thought about the advocacy role that would come from staying here and the need for physicians here. But I think that's almost more because I am interested in OBGYN that I see the need for the advocacy and staying. In terms of like what I've had these discussions with my classmates and other medical students I know about whether or not they would consider staying and if it does influence their decision. And I think it is something that is actively on people's mind, not just to be able to get the abortion training, but as Dr. Teal was saying, for other workforce reasons, because as a woman, it's not just about my patients, it's also about me and what I would have access to were I to become pregnant. So I think it's a huge consideration that I think about like pretty frequently as well.
Thanks. So on that same note, maybe if Professor Messiano and Mickey, do you have any comments on recruitment of students, researchers doing research, economic impact more globally? Because I think this is, you hit it right, this isn't just a OBGYN, not just a internal medicine, family physicians. Do you have any thoughts on of the ramifications for economic recruitment, other kinds of things?
I work with lots of folks who do research that's really cutting edge. And I mean, certainly we know there's a uterine transplant program at the Cleveland Clinic. We know that there are all kinds of exciting programs that involve laparoscopic fetal surgery, open fetal surgery, and other kinds of stem cell transplantation in utero, all kinds of exciting things. Those research programs and innovative care programs could result in a fetal demise. And, my colleagues who are thinking about the ethics and the legal ramifications of this are openly asking, is it okay to do this kind of research? Is it ethical to do this kind of research in a state where parents and physicians and researchers might be liable legally or lose their license in some way? And so I really do anticipate that as we move forward, I don't think we've totally seen it yet, but I think as we move forward from a policy perspective and a social perspective, I think we're going to see those programs really aggregating in states where they feel more supported and less legally at risk. And I think that's going to have a big economic impact, not just, I hate to go to this because I think that the most important impact, of course, is on the people who are pregnant and their families. But institutions are going to see an economic impact. The state is going to see an economic impact. You think about the person who works in the lab who, the big name researcher can move to another state. They're going to take their research program with them. All those people that work in their lab and are supported by them, they're not going to move to another state. They're going to be here without a job, right? So it's going to be an economic impact. And again, I don't think this is the most important thing that we always have to think about, but I do think it's something that maybe would catch people's attention to think about.
And as Dr. Messiano gets started, I just was going to say, in my intro, I mentioned that I do a lot of research in contraceptive technology development, and I have a 20-year career in that. And some of my co-collaborators, I just came to Ohio a year and a half ago to take the chair position. Some of them are very concerned about whether it is ethical for me to collaborate with them for us to be a site, because if there is a contraceptive failure in a novel contraceptive technology that we're developing and patients don't have access to abortion, that it may not be ethical to enroll patients at a trial site in the state of Ohio and other similar states.
Yeah.
I'm just getting started to say I have nothing to add.
Great. Well,
That was awesome.
There's a couple of questions here, and I think going off a little bit of the discussion kind of with the clinicians, but also really how our own values interface with this. And although we try to be agnostic in terms of the work we do in academic medicine, we're very human. And Nora, you stated that very, very eloquently and honestly, so thank you. I've got a question from somebody who's kind of grappling with, he's a general pediatrician, or she's a general pediatrician in urban environment, and she's seeing adolescents, and she's talking to them in private. And here we've got this whole thing that's looming over them. They may be at risk for unsafe sex and or unwanted pregnancy. How much do you gently nudge, right, to consider getting on contraception now before that door is closed, because who knows what that future may be or may not be. How much are, I think, reading between the lines, and is this individual kind of putting their own fears, projecting their own fears and values onto the patient? And how do we kind of manage all of that? And I'm not going to give everybody a pass, because Sam, I know you raised an adolescent daughter as well, so we both did. But I think these are the kinds of issues that we grapple with, and it's not just isolated from academic medicine, but our own values color the work we do, and how do we kind of balance that if they may be contrary to other kinds of values?
So I'm going to ask Noria to speak to this, but while she's getting the mic, I will say this is exactly what we mean when we're talking about reproductive justice, because what this law is doing is it's putting us in this position where our pediatric colleague is saying, should I coerce my patient to have a contraceptive method that she may not want? That's not right. You know, we don't like push contraception on people. We don't say like, hey, you know, you're 17 and you're having intercourse. You know, we do. We say, okay, you know, do you want a baby? What do you want to do? And if they say, I don't want to do anything, we don't hopefully beat them over the head about it until they do what we want them to do. Because I'm the doctor and I don't want you to have a teen pregnancy, because teen pregnancy is bad. But you know, so it really, again, it creates this force that I'm going to say kind of perverts the way we want to be thinking about how we interact with our community of patients.
Yeah, and I think the idea of sort of like contraceptive coercion and how we counsel patients about contraception, especially, you know, just in our day-to-day, whether it's in the clinic or in the hospital, I think there is a tendency in OBGYN that we really have to own about only talking about certain forms of contraception with certain patient populations, or like the perceptions that you bring into conversations of like, oh, well, this patient probably would do better with an IUD because of my own personal perception. So I'm only going to talk about X, Y, and Z. And I think that's a huge problem that comes up. I think also something that's been really difficult for me is the idea of this sort of like passive acceptance of the risk of pregnancy. And I think a lot of patient populations that I work with in residency will come in with this understanding that they don't have a lot of control over their reproductive justice and how their life goes. Like, I feel like because there's not control in a lot of aspects of their lives, when they come to the clinic talking about contraception, it's sort of this like, well, I don't want to be on anything, but I also, you know, if I become pregnant, I guess that's just what it is. And so I think that's something that's been really difficult for me as a physician to sort of have those conversations with patients.
And I was going to say that as a mother of adult children, but I'm very glad that there are physicians like you that will talk to my adolescent children about these complex issues, right? Because they don't always want to hear it from their parents.
So we, you know, we've spent a lot of time talking about some of the unintended consequences, and maybe some of you know the answer to this, but it may be apocryphal, but one of my urology colleagues had said that she had observed a spike in vasectomies soon after the Dobbs, you know, and so that lay it out for whatever. If it's true, that's an interesting observation. But we have another question in the audience.
Hello, Juan Jeffrey. I work here at the Cancer Center. I have a question kind of about the darker side of all the discussion about abortion care and access. You said, Julia, that you were a patient advocate at the abortion center and helping people in the parking lot. How do you deal with, like, you know, with is there increased sense of like violence, or like, you know, the threat of violence, you know, for abortion care? Obviously that's a real thing. Some people are, you know, prone to violent outbursts. Like, how do you deal with that as care providers? And since you're right on the front line, you're walking there, do you feel like threatened? And how do you deal with that?
We were like being very vigilant in the days after Dobbs to try to see like if anything was going to happen. Nothing really has happened. Nothing really has changed. Even in the times when abortion was only legal up to 6 weeks, we were surprised to not see a change in the number of protesters. We thought maybe they would decrease. Maybe they thought that they won. they were still there. The same people were still there every day. Nothing changed. There hasn't really been any changes. I think if anything, people are just still trying to decrease access to care and doing what they can to prevent it. But for us, there hasn't been any change, but we've been very vigilant to make sure. And we had a security guard for many years who was always very much just looking out specifically for us to make sure that that was the case.
And just on follow-up to that, one of the first questions we had is we have other people that want to figure out how to volunteer like you are. So if you can share that information, I think that would be helpful and very powerful.
Yeah, I think the email is clevelandprochoiceescorts@gmail.com, and they can email to volunteer. If not, I can try to give it to someone, but I think that's what the email is.
The preterm side, I think, and they.
Oh, yeah. Or if you email me, I can make sure. jcf112@case.edu.
I'm not going to
Yeah.
let you put your
So-
email out there. I'm sorry, but I'm a mama bear sometimes, okay?
No, but the preterm website is easily accessible, and they can help direct you if you're interested in that.
But I think your part of what I hear your point is pretty important, that we should be looking for ways of de-escalating. We should be looking for ways of staying safe and helping our colleagues stay safe, because people are ramped up about these things in ways that aren't necessarily logical or rational, and they get ramped up by this language in the press. They that makes it uncivil and unsafe at times, and we need to respect one another's experiences and the traumas people are experiencing. And the darker side also is the incredible suffering that we're trying to help with across the board, and that can get lost. So I appreciate that comment. I know we're very close to time. How are we?
We're very close. We've got a question, and there are a couple of questions that I have online as well. And just, Julia, your memory was accurate. That was the email address. I got confirmation.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm a first year medical student at Case, and I really obviously appreciate opportunities like this to talk about abortion and the stance that the school takes. But one thing I'd like to see more is actual education in the medical school curriculum on abortion. And I haven't yet seen action on the school's part to incorporate that. I know, Dr. Messiano, there's a little bit in Block 2 about contraception and things like that, but I think one thing Julia said that was very true and that I've definitely seen is this is a very self-selected group, and the sort of people that, students at least, that show up to these sorts of events and things to do with reproductive health. But in any specialty, people are almost guaranteed to encounter a pregnant woman. And so I think it's very important to have this sort of education for anyone and for every medical student, because it's very easy to avoid getting that education in medical school. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on if and how that should be required in curricula.
Yeah, thanks for that. We are in the process of retooling Block 2 to a certain extent, and taking into account what I've heard tonight, it's clear that we need to take a deeper dive into not just the biology, but the sociology of how one person deals with another person when these issues arise. And as you've heard tonight from the people at the coalface, not me, these are one-on-one situations that are hard to teach empirically. They're sort of they're learnt by experience, but we can lay the foundation. And I'm so glad that Marsha is on the faculty teaching Block 2.
Lots of
And we have
lots of faculty.
Yeah, and we have OBGYN, Dr. Gangstead and various Wienerman and various others. So we will focus more on these issues in the coming year.
There's one there. And
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to add something to that question, because I think it kind of addresses your question too about the threat of violence. And I think that one of the biggest things I realized with the Dobbs decision is how sort of ostracized and lonely OBGYN felt over the summer. I feel like there is sort of this misconception that we're practicing a different type of medicine, or we have a different type of patients, or that's a special sort of circumstance. And I feel like what we're really missing is sort of the normalization that this is medical care and having support from our colleagues in other specialties. cardiologists have, patients that have peripartum cardiomyopathy and are exposed to risk in pregnancy. We have nephrologists that, we consult when we have our patients that are requiring dialysis at 24 weeks because they have horrible preeclampsia and chronic kidney disease. So I think one thing that I felt like was missing is sort of the support and voice from other specialties in medicine and just medicine at large to say, like, this isn't like a different type of doctor and this isn't a different type of medicine, but these are our patients and we can all sort of advocate for reproductive justice.
So I'm a faculty member here at Case, Clara Pelfrey. My question has to do with maternal age. I suspect, I don't actually know for a fact, but I suspect that a lot of women are waiting and having babies later. I know the rate of teen pregnancy has gone down, but I'm assuming the rate of elderly maternal pregnancy has gone up, and that this affects pretty much everyone here on the stage. And I'm just curious how it affects you. I'd like to start with research first, since I'm a researcher.
Well, there's no doubt that fertility and oocyte quality decreases with age, and IVF clinics, their main clientele is women with advanced age and couples that can't conceive because of that. So from the biological point of view, we don't know why that happens, but it happens, and there is good research trying to understand how to make the oocyte not, or increase the quality of the oocyte that is ovulated in a woman who's 35-year-old compared to one who is in her teens. And there are exciting things on the horizon in that regard. But clinically, it's a tough question, and it's societal because, you put off getting pregnant, and during that window when the biology is saying maybe you should be getting pregnant. And so maybe I shouldn't be answering this question because I have a Y chromosome.
So I will tell you that the distribution of, I'll put on I'm actually an epidemiologist as well. So the distribution of abortion patients actually is bimodal, with a peak between 15 and 19 and a second peak between 38 and 45. And so actually what we see is that you have people who feel unprepared for pregnancy early, and then you hit like kind of 19, 20, and people say, yeah, I guess I could do this. And then you hit kind of 24, 25 through the early 30s where people are actively trying to get pregnant. So the abortion ratio, abortion to live birth, the abortion ratio is much lower in the 20s and early 30s. Then you have at the outer edge of reproductive capacity, you have people who are seeing our colleague here about their abnormal genetic outcomes. So they have a desired pregnancy, but they're having an abortion because of genetic abnormalities, or it just didn't occur to them that they still needed to use birth control, or they have a new relationship and they were relying on the husband's vasectomy. And it's like, wait, this person doesn't have a vasectomy or whatever. But so a wide range of reasons, but we see a second blip starting at about 38 to about 45, 47.
I just want to mention that although we're centering discussions about surgical abortions up here because that tends to be the place where doctors are most involved, the vast majority of abortions today in this country, unlike when Roe v. Wade was passed, are not surgical abortions. They are pills, that you take very early in pregnancy that you can get through the mail. You're the epidemiologist. What is the number?
Yeah, so it's actually 60% of abortion. Now, again, that can be through 10 weeks. And as I was discussing previously, that is when most abortions occur. So medication abortion has now outpaced procedural abortion.
Right. So, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we keep thinking about how the fall of Roe v. Wade is impacting people. It doesn't mean that we're in the same place that we were pre-Roe v. Wade. Medicine has moved on, advanced quite a bit, as Sam said, and the situation is actually quite different for people who don't want to be pregnant now than it was before.
I think just There's one comment that somebody had raised a comment online here, and I want to make sure that we do justice to this, and I think it may be something that will continue. But I think that there's something that we do need to keep in mind is that we are all raised in cultural settings. We are social beings, and academic medicine is only one aspect of our culture. I can look around. People have different faiths and faith beliefs. And, you know, there are questions about when does a fetus become a human? And we've kind of touched on some of those, not directly on that question, but I think what I would hope is that the responses that we've had, particularly regarding taking care in maternal fetal health, taking care of you have two patients. These are not decisions that are made lightly, I think, by our colleagues, by anybody. And I think it's important to keep that in mind is that these are complicated decisions, these are complex decisions, and that we have a primary fiduciary responsibility in our role in academic medicine to act to protect. And and sometimes that means advocacy, and sometimes it may not. And so I think that's an internal justification that we all have to grapple with and sort through. And I'm looking at my colleague, the bioethicist with whom I've collaborated for 15 years. So I just want to say that there is room for those kinds of discussions in these discussion series as well. And I think to pretend that those don't exist essentially cuts up part of our humanity and who we are and what shapes us as who we are. So I just wanted to put a footnote there and encourage us to have these kinds of conversations that are difficult, that are messy. And I think we've demonstrated today very clearly we can do this in a very civil way with experts, including all of you in the audience, both remotely as well as in person. And to also maybe put a quick plug in that we've got another one coming up because the question kind of related to disinformation came up in the chat as well. That's our next conversation series, the end of March, and that'll be followed by one towards the end of April that looks at academic freedom, so I encourage everybody to come. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Ford to kind of give the final summation, if you would, please.
So I think it's less a summation than to thank the panel for an honest and frank conversation that is difficult to have amongst this audience and not just this audience, but any audience. And so thank you for taking your time and being here with us.